I just want to clarify that yesterday we saw machlokas in the Mishnah, and we're on the top of DAF Yuram and Aleph. We just did the Mishnah yesterday, and in the Mishnah we learned that there's a machlokas between Rabbi Yossi and the Chachamim as to whether or not an individual is allowed to volunteer to watch the wildly growing barley during the Shemitah year. Rabbi Yossi says it's perfectly okay for a person to volunteer for that. And the Chachamim disagree, and they say no, he can only watch it if the Lishka pays him, if the temple treasury pays him for that work. Now what's the reason for that? Because if he voluntarily watches it, say the Chachamim, then since it's hefker grain, because it's during the Shemitah year, he's going to be kona that grain. And then by donating it now to the temple, it cannot be used as a korban tzibur, as a communal korban, because it's owned by an individual. And so therefore the only way that it can be acquired to the tzibur in the proper fashion is if it comes from hefker. And therefore we pay him to watch over it so that it remains in its hefker state, that it's not purchased or owned, acquired by him through his watching of it.
A single rin could not donate for the tzibur?
Not when it comes to a korban tzibur. Not when it comes to a korban tzibur, has to be, and this is a strange shita. I mean, it's something that needs to be clarified. So the Gemara is going to work on clarifying this issue today. Ma ra'az man atse kohanim v'ha'am lihimanos. The Gemara is asking a question on a Mishnah in Maseches Tainis. There are certain families, among them Kohanic families, that are not allowed to fast on certain days throughout the calendar year. Maseches Tainis deals with days in which a person is not allowed to fast. Why? Because they're celebratory days because of certain historic events that took place on those days. So there's a certain day that's designated. One of those days is the 10th of Av, and there are other dates on the calendar as well. And that date of 10th of Av is when a certain family's donated wood to the temple, and because their wood was accepted as a special gift, it had special status, anyone from that family is not allowed to fast on that day. So the Gemara asks the question, why is their wood gift such a special thing? Why is it counted as one of those days in which a person is not supposed to fast? So Ela Bisha Sha'alu Yisrael min Hagola v'lo matzu eitzim balishka, when the Jewish people made aliyah to build the second temple with Ezra, and there were limited funds, as we've learned before, and there was an economic crisis in getting all the funds necessary to build the Beis HaMikdash. There was not enough wood in the Lishka to bring karbanos. So these individual families stepped forward. They volunteered and they donated all of the wood that was needed in order to bring karbanos. V'karvu mehem karbanos tzibor, and they therefore brought all of the karbanos tzibor from using the wood that these families had donated. V'hisnu imahim neviim shebeinehem she'afilu lishka malaya eitzim v'amdu elu v'nisnadvu eitzim mishal atzman shelo yehi karven miskar v'ela mishalahen techila. And from that point onwards, the prophets that were around during the beginning of the Second Temple period, Chagai, Zechariah, Malachi, Ezra, Nehemiah, they made a rule that from that point forward, even if the lishka was full, but if you're a member from that family and you want to donate your wood, we take your wood, give it highest priority, and we immediately bring it for the ma'aracha, for the wood that's on the altar. Now, what does this have to do with our discussion? Here is an example of individuals donating something to be used as a community offering. So, Amar Rabbi Acha de Rabbi Yossi. The Rabbi Yossi Omar afilu harotza misnadev shomer chinam. So Rabbi Acha concludes that this whole Mishnah in Tainus must go according to Rabbi Yossi, who says that it is permitted for an individual to donate his services to the temple, even if it's for a community sacrificial purpose. Because according to the Chachamim, it would not be permitted to accept private donations of wood. Rabbi Yossi b'shem Rabbi Ila says no. He holds divrei. This is Rabbi Yossi the Amora, not Rabbi Yossi the Tana. He says no. He says divrei hakolhi, because ma pligin begufo shel karban aval b'machshirei karban kol ama modiyi shuhu mishtana karban yachil lekarban sibur. He says no, even the Chachamim can agree that to accept wood donations is permitted, because that's not going towards the body of the korban. When it comes to donating to the body of the korban, that's where the Chachamim say that an individual cannot act as a shomer for the free-growing barley, the wild-growing barley, because that he's actually taking possession of the barley itself, and the barley itself cannot be privately owned in order to be used as a korban sibor. But if it's just the wood, which is an accessory to the korban itself, the accessories to the korban can be donated by individuals. It's just the actual korban sibor that cannot be donated by an individual. So tini, isha sha'asasa kisones livna kesheira uvovad shetimserena letzibor. We have another brisa which says that if the mother of the Kohen Gadol, just as an example, a private individual, wants to sew her little boychik, who's now the Kohen Gadol, she wants to make the tunic for her son, for Yom Kippur. So we accept it. We accept it if you want to get Yiddish Anachis, and you want to say, that's my boychik, and this is what I made for him. It's a beautiful little tunic, right? And so we accept it, but provided that she donates it to the tzibor first.
Does that mean anyone can wear it, though? If she does that?
Well, if it's specified for the Kohen Gadol, then I don't think that anyone can wear it. So, Amar Rabbi Acha de Rabbi Yossi, he de Rabbi Yossi Omer, Af harotza misnadev shomer chinam. So once again, Rabbi Acha comes along and says that this brisa can only go according to Rabbi Yossi, who says that an individual is allowed to donate something for the communal sacrificial purposes. But according to the Chachamim, this would not be permitted. Comes along Rabbi Yossi b'shem Rabbi Ila, once again, same machlokas, and he says, no, divrei akoli, ma pligin begufa shel karban, aval b'machshiri karban kol amamodi shu mishtana karban yachid lekarban sibor. And once again, you see this is basically the same machlokas. Here too, Rabbi Yossi the Amora says, no, this is not just according to Rabbi Yossi the Tana, this could go according to the Chachamim as well. Because the Chachamim only take issue when the body of the korban, the corpus of the korban itself, is donated by a yachid. But when the accessories of the korban, the garment of the Kohen Gadol, is donated by a yachid, that's perfectly okay, even according to the Chachamim. The Gra here changes the girsa. We're going to use the girsa of the Gra, and he says, Masnisin pliga al Rabbi Acha. Our Mishnah disproves, or actually a Mishnah, the Mishnah in Tainus that we cited above, disproves Rabbi Acha's position that remember, what does Rabbi Acha say? He says not only is there a machlokis in a case when an individual donates the korban itself, but even when an individual donates the accessories of the korban, there's also a machlokis. The Brisa or the Mishnah in Tainus seems to disprove that position, because Osan says Osan Hayomim Noagin Bishas Karban Vishlo Bishas Karban, and Rabbi Yossi Omer Ein Noagin Elo Bishas Karban Bilvad, because the Mishnah in Tainus says that there's a machlokas between the Chachamim and Rabbi Yossi as to whether these festive days of the wood donation on the 10th of Av applies both during temple times or after temple times. The Chachamim say it applies both during temple times and after temple times, and Rabbi Yossi says it applies only during temple times but not after temple times, when they were no longer accepting wood donations because there's no longer a mizbeach. Now, what do you see from this? You see from here that it's not just Rabbi Yossi who's the author of this Mishnah, because Rabbi Yossi is the one who's arguing with the Tanakama. The Tanakama, who's presumably the Chachamim, say that this halacha, that these are festive days that we accepted the wood from these private families, is considered to be a festive day. This 10th of Av is a festive day. So even the Chachamim agree that you accept accessory donations from private individuals. So this is the Gemara's proof, because if Rabbi Yossi disagrees with the Tanakama, then obviously the Tanakama can't be Rabbi Yossi. So this shows that Rabbi Acha is mistaken. Rabbi Acha was trying to suggest that the whole Mishnah goes like Rabbi Yossi. And yet it's Rabbi Yossi who's arguing with the Tanakama at this point, so it can't be that the Mishnah is like Rabbi Yossi only. Va'od minhad, and the Gra takes out the next words from the Minhada D'Tanya, and it furthermore says in the very same Mishnah, Amar Rabbi Eliezer be Rabbi Tzadok, Anu hayinu mi b'nei Sana'a ben Binyamin, b'chal Tishabav lios b'Shabbos, v'dachinu osa l'motzoi Shabbos, v'ayinu misanin v'lo mashlimim. The very same Mishnah or Brisa in Tainis continues by saying that Rabbi Elazar Reb Tzadok said, I come from the family of Bnei Sana'ah, who were from the tribe of Binyamin, who donated wood on the 10th of Av. And my family continues this tradition of not fasting on the 10th of Av to this day, even after the Churban Habayis. And he's testifying in order to prove that the position of the Tanna Kama is correct, that these are festive days even after the Churban. That the 10th of Av is a festive day even after the Churban. And he illustrates it by saying that one year, not too long ago, Tisha B'Av fell out on Shabbos. And what happens when Tisha B'Av falls out on Shabbos? You push the Tainus to Sunday. Well, the problem is, Sunday is our festive day. It's the 10th of Av. So we had a dilemma. We have to fast because it's a Nidcha Tisha B'Av. But we're not allowed to fast because it's a festive day for our family. So what did we do? We fasted for a majority of the day, but towards the end of the day, we broke our fast. And that was sort of the compromise position that was an accepted norm in the times of the Mishnah and times of the Gemara. But anyway, what you see from here is that the machlokus between we're going to go like Rabbi Yossi in the conclusion of the Gemara, that the machlokus between Rabbi Yossi of the Mishnah and our Chachamim is only an individual donating the guf of the carbon itself, but not the accessory instruments such as the clothing of the Kohen Gadol or the wood of the Ma'aracha. Let's go on. Ha'omer shtei halechem v'lechem haponim v'chol karbanos hatzibor. The Mishnah had asked, what do we do with the Trumas Halishka, with the scoops of coins that we take out of the chamber? The answer is we purchase all community karbanos. So Taman Taninan, we learn elsewhere, Kol karbanos hayachid v'hatzibor bo'in min haaretz u'min chutz la'aretz, min hachadash u'min hayashan, chutz min haomer u'shtei halechem she'in bo'in ela min hachadash u'min haaretz. The Brisa says that all community and individual karbanos, the products that are used, whether it's animal products or plant products, they have to be domestic. They have to be grown or raised in Eretz Yisrael. They cannot come from Chutz La'aretz, except, says the Brisa says they are allowed to be exports. They can come, or imports. They can come from either in Eretz Yisrael, or they can come from outside of Eretz Yisrael. They can be chadash or yashan. They can be old wheat or new wheat. We don't require that we dafka have to use the new grain. We can use old grain as well. And the only exception to this rule is the carbon ha'omer, which can only be from new grain, and it has to be domestically grown. It can only be grown in Eretz Yisrael. Ushtei halechem, and the 2 loaves of bread that are waved over the mizbeach on Shavuos. Now, it's important to know what the function of the shtei halechem is. The function of the shtei halechem, which is brought on Shavuos, even though we know that the korban ha'omer, the barley offering, is matir chadash, it allows us to eat the new grain. That's only for gevulim. That's only for outside the temple. Inside the temple, chadash grain is not accepted on the altar until the shtei halechem is waved over the mizbeach with the 2 wheat loaves. So you see, therefore, that it's necessary for both the korban ha'omer and the shtei halechem to be domestically grown, because their whole purpose in being brought is for domestically grown grain products for chadash in Eretz Yisrael. So Rav Huna b'shem Rabbi Yirmiyah de Rabbi Yishmael, he says, goes according to Rabbi Yishmael. The Rabbi Yishmael Omer ein ha'omer ba min haSurya, because Rabbi Yishmael says that the korban ha'omer may not be brought from Syria. Now, where is Syria? Syria is Syria. And what he's basically saying is that even though during the times of David HaMelech, King David annexed portions of Syria and made it part of Eretz Yisrael, it nevertheless did not have full Kedushas Haaretz vis-a-vis the produce that is grown there. So the point that Rabbi Shmuel is saying is that no grain that's grown outside of Eretz Yisrael, even if it's Syria, which is annexed for certain purposes as part of Israel, is not allowed. You're not allowed to use that grain. So where do we see that this goes like Rabbi Yishmael? Because if you don't hold like Rabbi Yishmael and you're allowed to use imported grain for the korban ha'omer, so then there would be no requirement of the brisa that you can only use Eretz Yisrael grain for the korban ha'omer. So clearly this goes like Rabbi Yishmael. Taman Taninan, and we learn in another brisa, Eser Kedushos Hein. There are 10 levels of Kedusha geographically. Eretz Yisrael Mikudeshes Mikol Harotzes. The land of Israel is a holier geographic location than any other land in the world. Umahi Kedusha. So what is its holiness? Shemevian Mimena Haomer Vehabikur Mushtei Halechem Mashe'ein Mevian Kain Mikol Harotzes. This brisa reflects the same idea, that you can only bring the Korban HaOmer and the Shtei HaLechem, and it has a third thing, which is Bikurim, first fruits, can only be brought from Eretz Yisrael, it cannot be brought from any other land. Rabbi Chia b'shem Rabbi Yirmiyah de Rabbi Yishmael, he, the Rabbi Yishmael Omer, Ein HaOmer Ba Min HaSurya. And this brisa too, goes like Rabbi Yishmael for the very same reason, that Rabbi Yishmael says you cannot bring the Korban HaOmer from any other land, even if it's from Syria, it's not kosher. So clearly you see that this is in sync with Rabbi Yishmael. Taman. It's a good question what the status of the Golan Heights is. I think that the Golan Heights was never part, I may be mistaken, but I don't think it was ever part of the Surya that we're talking about here. I think the Golan is still considered to be part of Eretz Yisrael proper. But I'm not an expert on this, so don't take my word for it. Right, Rabbi Gold would probably know. Taman Taninan, Rabbi Yishmael Omer, Macharish Rishus, Afkatzir Rishus. We have another brisa that says that according to Rabbi Yishmael, there's a pasuk in the Torah that says, Becharishu v'akatzir tishbos, that on Shabbos there is a commandment to rest from both plowing and harvesting. So what we learn from that pasuk is that just like there's never a mitzvahs aseh to plow, so too, therefore the Torah is only prohibiting permitted non-mitzvah plowing, so too the Torah is only prohibiting permitted non-mitzvah harvesting. So what does that come to exclude? Yatsa ketzir ha'omer shuhu mitzvah. This comes to the exclusion of harvesting the Korban ha'omer. The Korban ha'omer is a mitzvah. It's a mitzvah to plow, to harvest it on the 16th of Nisan. And therefore what we see from this pasuk is that the mitzvah of harvesting the barley on the 16th of Nisan overrides Shabbos, such that if the 16th of Nisan would fall out on Shabbos, you would still harvest the barley on Shabbos itself. What we also learn from there, and this is spoken out by the Meforshim, is that this also applies to Shemitah. That even though normally you're not allowed to harvest produce during Shemitah, but you are allowed to harvest the Korban HaOmer when you have wildly growing barley. You're allowed to harvest it during the Shemitah year in order to do the mitzvah of the Korban HaOmer, because we apply the laws of Shabbos to the laws of Shemitah. Okay, Rabbi Yishmael Kedaite, the Rabbi Yishmael Da'amar, Ein Amar Ba Min HaSurya. Kedaite Da'amar Yatsa Ketzir HaOmer Shuhu Mitzvah. So the Gemara says this is consistent with Rabbi Yishmael elsewhere. Rabbi Yishmael says that the Korban HaOmer cannot be brought from Syria, it can only be brought from Eretz Yisrael, and so therefore it's a mitzvah to harvest the barley from Eretz Yisrael. You see, if you could bring the barley from Chutz La'aretz, then there would be no mitzvah to harvest Shemitah produce in Eretz Yisrael. The laws of Shemitah only apply to Eretz Yisrael. They don't apply to Chutz La'aretz. So therefore, the only way that you could argue that there's a mitzvah dafka to harvest barley during Shemitah is only if the only place where you can harvest the barley is in Eretz Yisrael. So this is consistent with Rabbi Yishmael. Now, now the question is, Man tana shomri svichis v'ashvias no linschar mitrumas halishka, Rabbi Yishmael he. And therefore, in the same vein, when the Mishnah says, our Mishnah, now we're going back to our Mishnah says that you're allowed to hire watchers to be in charge of guarding and protecting the wildly growing barley during the Shemitah year to ensure that we have barley to bring for the Korban HaOmer. So this must also go like Rabbi Yishmael, because if not, then there would be no reason, there would be no justification to use Trumas Halishka money in order to hire people to watch something that isn't necessary. If we could import grain from Chutz La'aretz, so what's the point of watching over Shemitah produce that is growing wildly in Eretz Yisrael? Let's just import the produce from China or wherever else it's growing, and we don't have to use Trumas Halishka money to hire guardians. So this too shows that our Mishnah goes like Rabbi Yishmael, who says that the Korban HaOmer produce can only come from Eretz Yisrael. So Amar Rabbi Yosa, no. Divrei HaKol hi lo matzu b'Surya mevin osun misfichin sheb Eretz Yisrael. So Rabbi Yossi says, no, I could argue that it's possible that our Mishnah even goes according to the opinion that argues with Rabbi Yishmael and says that you are allowed to import the barley for the Korban Homer from Chutz La'aretz. Why then does our Mishnah justify hiring watchers? The answer is because we could be talking about a situation where there's a famine in the rest of the world, and barley is not available for import. And therefore, if there's no other available barley in the rest of the world, then we let you hire watchers from the money of the Lishka in order to watch wildly growing barley to make sure that it grows without being tampered with. So now the Gemara asks the following question. Let's go back to our Mishnah. Hahein Omer, Mahu Sheyizra Batchila. The question now is as follows. The Shemitah year, we need to bring the Korban HaOmer, and we can't find any wildly growing barley. We just can't find it. We can't find it anywhere in Eretz Yisrael. So now the question is, would it be permitted to plant barley in the middle, in anticipation of it growing in time for Nisan, even though it's clearly usher to plant during the Shemitah year? Would it be permitted not only to harvest during the Shemitah, but would it be permitted to plant during Shemitah as well, if you need the barley for the Korban HaOmer? So Rabbi Chia bar Ada, boy kumi Rabbi Mana. So Rabbi Chia bar Abba says, if you are going to entertain that it is mutter, I have a separate question. And my question is as follows. Lo nimtza kekometz ala shirayim she'eineh cholin. He says, if you're going to say that it's mutter, but you're not going to solve anything, because let's learn a halacha about the laws of a mincha. What is a mincha? Mincha is a flour offering that's made from either wheat or barley. When you grind it into flour, you put it into a container, and the Kohen, as we learned together in Maseches Menachem a couple years ago, the Kohen does an act called kemitza. He takes a fistful of the flour, and that's the kometz that is placed on the mizbeach. What happens to the remainder of the flour that's left in the container? That's called shirayim, and it is now, once the kemitza is done, it becomes edible to the kohanim who are bringing the mincha. We learn a halacha in Maseches Menachos that if the kometz is not matir the shirayim ba'achila, if it doesn't permit the shirayim to be eaten, then the kometz itself cannot be brought as a mincha, it cannot be brought as a karban. So the question that he asks is as follows. Let's say you were permitted to plant, because you can be docha the mitzvahs lo saseh of Shemitah. But it's still not going to be a kosher mincha, because lamaisa, the flour, is not going to be consumable. It's not edible because it's Shemitah produce that was planted illicitly, so it's not consumable for humans. Maybe you could say that it'll be docha for the purpose of bringing them the Korban HaOmer, but you can't eat the shirayim. If you can't eat the shirayim, then the kometz itself is not going to be kosher. So what? So how is it? It's like a catch-22, is basically what he's saying. So how do you solve that? So Amalei nasa kechamisha dvarim shein boin betuma ve'ein echolin betuma. So the answer that was given by the Rebbe is that no. He says there are certain instances where the kometz is still kosher, even though the shirayim is not edible. Because let's say the shirayim becomes tameh. If the shirayim becomes tameh, it's one of those like 5 things that can be brought, 5 types of karbanos that can be brought in a state of tumah. And one of them is the kometz. Even though the shirayim are not edible because they're tameh, nevertheless the kometz is kosher. And similarly, even though the shirayim of this particular korban homer are going to have the stigma of shmita upon them, nevertheless the kometz will still be kosher. We don't have a resolution to our question as to whether you're allowed to plant or not, but at least the argument is that in theory it should be permitted if the only impediment was the shirayim issue. So Keitzad hu osa. So now the Gemara asks another question. How do we pay the people who are in charge of watching the sefichim, the wildly growing barley? How do we pay them? The dilemma is that if the money from the Trumas Halishka is hektish, you can't give hektish money to a hedjot, to a regular person. How do we remove the kedusha off of the hektish money? So the Gemara gives a very strange answer, which I confess that I don't completely understand. It's very ambiguous. So I'm going to tell you what I think the pshat is. You're welcome to disagree, but disagree with me later because we're running out of time. Okay? So no tel ma'os min hashulchani. What you're supposed to do is you ask the money changers that work outside the temple to advance the money to the watchers, because you want to pay them up front every day that they do the watching. So even though the bill is due for their services even before the barley is fully grown. So that's why you ask the shulchani to advance them the money. And then you give that before the korban ha'omer. V'nosin l'kosin v'lashomer. Period. Ad shelo yikarev ha'omer u'meivimos mitrumas halishka u'mechalin olav. And then right before the korban ha'omer is brought as a korban, you take money from the trumas halishka and you transfer the kedusha of those coins onto the barley, onto the barley itself. The barley now becomes kadosh, okay, and the coins now become chulin, and you can pay back the shulchani for the money that they advanced to the workers. So the Gemara now says, "V'tavos kain." Is it really proper to do that? And the Korban Ha'ida learns that the question is, after all, the money that you need to expend for the labor costs far exceeds the value of the barley. So the problem is, asks the Gemara, that let's say the labor cost is $100. The barley itself that you're bringing for the korban ha'omer is only $5. It's $5 worth of barley probably that you have to put on the mizbeach. So the question is, how can you take so much money, $100 worth of hektish coins, and transfer it on such a small amount of barley? So the Gemara says, Rabbi Acha b'shem Rabbi Ba, kol ma sheyitain hein damav misha'a harishona. It's a very ambiguous answer. There could be a number of different ways of learning it, but this is how I'm understanding it. That whatever they give, they're giving it with that intention originally. Like the Korban Ha'ida says, that the treasurer of the temple had understood from the very outset that he was going to be taking a large sum of money and going to be mechalal it onto the korban, onto the barley, and it really is a type of compensation directly to the workers. Meaning, in this kind of situation, even though normally you're not supposed to take a large amount of kedusha and transfer its kedusha onto a small amount of value, technically it can be done when there's no other option, and therefore it's as if he's paying the workers directly with chulin money. So basically the Gemara is saying this is really the only option that you have, and therefore we allow it. There could be another way of learning this Gemara, but that's the way I'm understanding the answer. The Gemara now says, Tana af bepischei avonim kain. So we have the same dilemma when it comes to the stone cutters who are responsible for the construction of the temple. Keitzad hu osa, how are you supposed to pay the guys who are the quarrymen who are in charge of cutting the stones for the construction of the temple? So no tilmos meshulchani v'nosein lachos v'nulasatosim. You ask the money changers to advance the money to the workers so that they get paid in a timely fashion even before the temple is constructed. Ad shelo tinasein al gabi hadimos. That's true. Even you pay them even before the stones are placed on the row that is being used for the walls of the temple. Umishanitin al hadimos. Once these stones are placed on the line, meaning that they're laid as bricks on the temple walls, Mevi maos mitrumas halishka. Then you bring money from the trumas halishka, umechalin aleha, and then you take that money and you transfer its kedusha onto the stones. So the Gemara asks a similar question: V'tavos kain, is this appropriate to do? After all, the labor costs far exceed the value of the individual stones. So Rabbi Yossi, Bei Rabbi Bon, b'shem Shmuel, kol ma sheyitain, hein dameha misha'a harishon. The very same answer, whatever we answered for the first, will be the answer for the second as well. That since the Gizbar, since the treasurer of the temple knew that he had to pay this money out, and this is the only option that he has, we consider it as if he's paying the workers directly, and therefore we allow, even though since it's technically doable, we allow a large amount of kedusha money to be transferred onto a small amount of material. Let's go on to the next Mishnah. The Mishnah says, Para v'so'ir ha'mishtaleach v'loshen shel zahoris boin mitrumas halishka. Now, the Mishnah is going to itemize things that are considered to be communal korban needs. There are things that are ancillary to the communal korban needs that you cannot use the money from the trumas halishka, but these are things that are directly related to korban needs. And the chiddush of our Mishnah is that even though these are sacrificial things that are not sacrificed in the temple itself, but they're prepared outside the temple, nevertheless they're considered to be karbanos tzibor for the purpose of using the money from the trumas halishka. So the one example is the para aduma, which is burned outside the temple. Another example is the goat that is sent out to Azazel on Yom Kippur out into the wilderness. Lashon shel zahoris is the string that is made out of scarlet wool that is burned together with the paraduma. That costs money as well. So all of these items can be derived and expended from the trumas halishka. Now, kevesh para v'kever sira mishtaleach v'lashon shebein karana v'amas hamayim v'chomos ha'ir v'migdaloseha v'chol tzarchei ha'ir boin mishiori halishka. However, there are certain things that cannot come from the trumas halishka because they're not directly related to the korban. They're not necessary for the korban. What examples are these? There was a bridge or a ramp that they built to cause the para, the young red heifer that was being raised in an absolute state of tahara. They constructed bridges that could only be used for this para so that it would never be exposed to tumah. So whatever costs go into constructing that bridge, and the same thing, there was a ramp or a bridge that they built for the seir, for the goat being sent out to Azazel. Those construction costs could not be taken from the Trumas Halishka, but they could be taken from the Shiare Halishka, the coins that were left on the floor of the chamber that were not part of the scoops. That money could be used for these purposes. And similarly, you use that money for the string that is tied between the animal's horns before you push it off the cliff. Again, that's not absolutely vital for the korban, and therefore you can only use the shiare halishka. You also, there was an aqueduct that runs through through the temple and through Yerushalayim, that also can only be paid for from the Shiari Halishka, and all costs for Yerushalayim construction can only be paid for from the Shiari Halishka. Okay, Abishol Omer, Kevesh Para Kohanim Gedolim Osin Mishel Atzma. That ramp or bridge that was used for the Para Aduma, the Kohen Gadol paid for it himself. That came out of the pockets of the Kohanim Gedolim themselves. Mosar Shiari Lishka Mahayu Osin Bahen. Now the Mishnah asks, what was done with the leftover money from the Shiare Lishka, meaning the money that's on the floor of the Lishka that was not part of the Trumas Lishka? What do you do with that? Lochin Bahen Yeno Shomim Shmonim Uslatos Vehaschar Lehektish. So the Tanakama says, whatever surplus you have, invest that money and use it to purchase consumable goods like wine, oil, and flour, and sell it at a profit. And this way you'll be raising proceeds for the Beis HaMikdash. That's according to Rabbi Yishmael. But Rabbi Akiva Omer, Ein Mistakrin B'Shel Hektish, Aflo Mishal Aniyim. Rabbi Akiva disagrees. He says that's not derech eretz to make the Beis HaMikdash into a grocery store. You're not supposed to do that. And he says the Beis HaMikdash is an honorable place of kedusha. We don't worry about how the raising proceeds for the Beis HaMikdash in such a mundane fashion, and therefore leave the money as it is, and whatever comes in will come in. In a similar vein, the Mishnah says that when you collect money for tzedakah for aniyim, you're not allowed to invest that by trying to make a profit off of it by investing it and then making more money. Why? Because maybe an ani will come while the money is in the stocks or being invested in consumable goods, and there's no money in the coffers now to give to the ani. So therefore we don't allow you to do that, even though the intentions are good, because you want to, let's say, invest the money that you've collected for tzedakah and make more money off of it. You're not allowed to do that.
You also may lose, right?
You also may lose. That's also a good reason. Mosar hatruma mahoyu osinba. So now the Mishnah asks, what was done with the surplus? If there was any money left in the scoops, the boxes themselves that were used for the Trumas Halishka, what if you don't use all of those coins? So what were they used for? Remember, these have a higher level of Kedusha. So they used it for Rikuei Zahav Tzipur Lebeis Kodesh HaKadoshim. You used it for the plating material. There was a thin gold plate that was on the walls and the floor of the Kodesh HaKadoshim. That's what it would be used for. Rabbi Yishmael Omer, Mosar HaPeiros, Kayetz HaMizbeach, Moser Truma Lichlei Shares. Rabbi Yishmael says, if you have Mosar Peiros, which the Gemara will explain. It means leftover produce. Now, what the produce that is, some kind of sacrificial produce, the Gemara will explain exactly what that is. But if you have extra money left over from that, then you use that to buy korbanos that will be used for what's called the kayetz hamizbeach. Kayetz, some pronounce it as kitz. I don't know how they punctuate it in the art scroll, but they call it kitz or kates with a tzeira. So what it means is, I think it's more correct to say kayetz, but it doesn't matter. The point is that what it is that it is whenever there's downtime on the altar, we have always a little bit of extra money in our coffers of the temple to make sure that the altar is never, we want to make sure that it never goes dark. We want to make sure that there's activity constantly in the Beis HaMikdash. So whenever there's downtime and we don't have karbanos being brought, we bring karbanos nedava from surplus monies that were donated to the temple, and that's what's called the kates or the kayetz hamizbeach. Right. So mosar truma lichlei sharis. If you have leftover money from the trumas halishka, this Rabbi Shmuel says not that you would use it for the plating, but Rabbi Shmuel says you would use it for the klei sharis. You'd use it to purchase utensils that are used in the Beis HaMikdash. Rabbi Akiva Omer Moser Truma L'Kayetz HaMizbeach and Moser Nesachim L'Chlei Sharis. Rabbi Akiva disagrees. He says whatever's left over from the Trumas Halishka would go to purchase Korbanos Nedava for the kites, for the downtime on the altar, and whatever's left from libation money, if people donated money for wine, and you have leftover money, that would go to purchase the klei sharis, the ministering utensils. Rabbi Chanan Yiskana Kohanim Omer, Mosar Nechaz Nesachim Kayetz HaMizbech, he disagrees, and he says leftover libation money is used for the Kayetz HaMizbech, the downtime, and Mosar Atruma L'Klei Sharis, and what's left over from the Trumas Halishka goes for the klei sharis, for the instruments. But both these latter opinions, both Rabbi Chanan Yiskana Kohanim and Rabbi Akiva, hold that you didn't use the extra payros money for those purposes. And the Gemara will explain. The Gemara now says, Kevesh para v'chulei, the ramp for the para aduma, Rabbi Shmuel bar Nachman b'shem Rabbi Yonasan Gimel Lashanos Hein. There are 3 strings that are made of scarlet wool that are used sacrificially. What are these 3 strings? Shel So'ir Bisela, with the Seir HaMishtaleach, for the goat to Azazel ceremony, you took a long red string and you cut it in half. You put one half of the string and tied it between the horns of the animal, and then you'd push it off the cliff. But before you did that, you tied another half of the string, you tied it to a rock that was at the top of the cliff, that was visible to the people who were doing the avoda. And what miraculously would happen is that when Bnei Yisrael would receive a kapara, then the scarlet string would turn white, or at least it would fade in its color. And so this was a sign that they had been forgiven for their sins. So yes, so this string was purchased. You needed a sella's worth of string because it was a longer string. The Mitzora needs to use a scarlet string in his purification karbanos, as the Torah prescribes, but since his string is only half as long as the string for Azazel, it only has to be from a shekel, which I think is the machatzis a shekel amount. Shel para bishtei slaim, the para aduma string has to be a heavier cord, and in order for it to mix in properly with the ash. And so because it was so thick, it had to be 2 sellas worth of scarlet wool. Rabbi Chunya de Baras Chavrin, Rabbi Ba Bar Zavda b'shem Rabbi Shimon ben Chalafta, Shel Para b'shtei slam u'mechza. He says it was not just shtei slam; it was 2.5 slam. V'ista mafkin lishna ba'asar zuz, and some say that it was 2.5 slam, which is equal to 10 zuz, meaning that 10 zuz equals 2.5 slam. It's just a difference of opinion as how that measurement was expressed. Rabbi Yehuda b'shem Rabbi Shmuel Talmidei Chachamim Hamalamdin Es HaKohanim Hilchos Shchita Hilchos Kabbalah Hilchos Rivke Nolden Schar Mitrumas Halishka. Rabbi Yehuda says in the name of Rabbi Shmuel that there were Talmidei Chachamim who were brought into the temple to instruct the Kohanim how to do their avoda. They would teach them the laws of Shchita, Kabbalah, Holacha, and Zrika. and they had to be compensated, right? Because they can't just do it for free. They need to eat also. So how would you pay them? Since this was a sacrificial need, they were paid from the Trumas Halishka. Rabbi Yitzchak bar Radifa b'shem Rabbi Imi mevakre mume kachim not linschar mitrumas Halishka. Similarly, he says that the Talmidei Chachamim who were in charge of examining animals to see if they had a mum or not, they also would be compensated from the monies of the Trumas Halishka.
You'd have to be poda it.
That's a good question. How would we be poda it? The Gemara here doesn't explain exactly how that was done. Perhaps the money was nifta on the animal. It's not clear. Rabbi Acha, Rabbi Tanchum Barchia b'shem Rabbi Simloi Magi Sefer Ha'azara Notlin Scharan Mitrumas Halishka. The Soifrim who were in charge, there was a Sefer Torah that was contained in the Azara, and the people who were in charge of being Magia, of fixing it and repairing it, they also got compensated from the Trumas Halishka, because apparently it was a sacrificial need, because you need to have a Sefer Torah present when you bring the Karbanos. Gidel bar Binyamin b'shem Rabbi Asi Shnei Dayone Gezelos Notlin Schar Mitrumas Halishka. There were two Dayanim, or two Batei Din, it's not clear, that were in charge of adjudicating laws of theft having to do with the temple. And again, I'm not clear on this issue, but it seems like this was temple related, because otherwise you can't take compensation from the Trumas Halishka. It must have been that whenever there were disputes as to whether a person owed money to the temple or not, or whether there was a dispute between two individuals, whether the animal is mine, whether the animal is yours, so then they would bring their disputes to the Dayanim, and the Dayanim would paskin, so they too would take their compensation from the Trumas Halishka. Shmuel Amar Nashim Ha'argos B'Parochos Notlin Scharan Mitrumas Halishka, and Rabbi Chuna Omer Mitrumas Bedek Habayis. So now we have a machlokes. The women who weaved the paroches, that was the partition between the Kodesh and the Kodesh HaKadoshim, did they get their money from the Trumas Halishka? That's one opinion. And the other opinion says, no, this is part of the construction of the temple. It's not part of the sacrificial needs, and therefore they got their money from the Bedek Habayis treasury, which is different from the Trumas Halishka. Ma polig, what's the machlokes? Shmuel avidla kekorban, Rav Huna avidla kebinyan. The machlokes is, does the paroches need to be there for sacrificial purposes? Meaning, is it necessary for the karbanos to be brought, that there needs to be a paroches present? If so, then it's a sacrificial need, and therefore you can pay them from the Trumas Halishka. But if it's not necessary for there to be a paroches present when the karbanos are brought, then it's only a construction need for the upkeep of the temple, and therefore you would pay them from the other treasury, which was for the upkeep of the temple. Amar Rabbi Chizkiya Tana Rabbi Yehuda God Godos Haktoris v'chol karbanos atzibur boin mitrumas halishka. This rabbi also says that the daily ketoris, the incense that was burned in the temple, and all communal sacrifices came from the trumas halishka. Mizbeach hazaha v'chol klei sharis boin mimosar nesachim. However, we saw the opinion that says that the surplus of libation money, that was what was used to purchase klei shares, to purchase movable vessels and instruments that were used in the temple, and therefore the Mizbeach HaZahav is part of that as well. It doesn't come from the Trumas Halishka, but rather comes from the surplus libation money, because it is a movable utensil. Since the Korban HaZahav, the Mizbeach HaZahav is movable. You lift it up off the floor. It's not therefore part of the Trumas Halishka sacrificial needs. Is considered to be a Kli Shares. Mizbeach Ha'ula ve'Ha'echel ve'Azaros born Misharei Halishka, but Chutz La'Azaros born Milishkas Bedek Habayis. Now the outer altar, which is in the temple courtyard, and all of the needs of the Heichal, of the structure of the temple itself, the covered part of the temple, and the Azara, which surrounds the Mizbeach, those are all needed for sacrificial. You need to have those in existence in order to bring a korban, and therefore you use their upkeep from the Trumas Halishka. But all things that are beyond that, such as the Ezras Nashim and all of the Lishkos that are beyond that, their upkeep is paid from the Bedek Habayis treasury. So, frek the Gemara v'hatani avnei hamizbeach ha'hechel v'azaros mo'alin bahen v'chiyesh me'ila v'shirayim. So the Gemara's question, I'm sorry, excuse me, these do not come from the Trumas Halishka. The Mizbeach and the Heichal and the Azoros do not come from the Trumas Halishka. My mistake. They rather come from the Shiarei Halishka. They come from the leftover monies. In other words, these are not related specifically, explicitly to the Karbanos. They're tangential to the Karbanos, and therefore you bring them from the Shiarei Halishka, from the leftover coins in the Lishka. So the Gemara now asks the question, V'hatani avnei hamizbeach ha'heichal v'azoros molin bahen v'chiyesh meila b'shirayim. So the Gemara asks, how then can the Brisa say if these structures, the Heichal and the Mizbeach, are paid for from the Shirayim of the Lishka, so then why are they subject to Me'ila? The coins that are the Shirayim do not have the Kedusha of the Trumas HaLishka. So why then should the stones that have the Kedusha of those coins passed on to them be subject to Me'ila? So Ela Reb Meir, de Reb Meir Omer Mo'elin B'Shirayim. The answer is that Brisa goes according to Reb Meir, because if you remember Reb Meir we saw yesterday or the day before, he says that the leftover coins that were not used in the Trumas HaLishka, also, if you run out of coins from the Trumas Halishka, you take from that Shirayim and you use that and you re-scoop them. And therefore, Reb Meir held that they have an intrinsic Kedusha, because since you may need them for later, for the Trumas Halishka, they have Kedusha right now. And so therefore that Brisa goes only according to Reb Meir. So the Gemara now says, Amar Reb Chia, Klum Amar Reb Meir, Ela B'Sok Shanaso, B'Hach Chutz L'Shnaso Anan Kayomin. So Reb Chia says that doesn't make any sense. Even according to Reb Meir, the only time that those coins have a tentative Kedusha from the Shiarei Halishka is only during the year that they were collected. Because you never know, you may need those coins if you run out of coins in the Trumas Halishka from the boxes. But once that year has elapsed, then those coins have no Kedusha whatsoever. And therefore, why should there be Me'ila when the Shirayim coins were the ones that were used for their construction and for their upkeep? There should be no Me'ila subject to those stones, because the only time that we advocate using the Shirayim coins is only once the year has elapsed after their collection. So the Gemara doesn't answer that question. The Gemara leaves that as a kasha. We don't have an answer to that question. We go weiter. Amar Reb Chizki, Yatana Reb Yehuda Gargaros, this same Reb Yehuda that we saw up above, he says, Hashulchan v'hamenorah v'hamizbechos v'haparoches ma'akvim es hakarbonos divrei Reb Meir. According to Reb Meir, that you need to have the showbread table and the menorah and all of the altars and the paroches. All of those things need to be standing in order to bring a karba. That's according to Reb Meir. And if any of those things are defective or not extant in their place, so then you can't bring a karban. And the Chachamim disagree. They say the only thing that needs to be present in the temple in order for the karbanos to be brought is the laver, the instrument and its stand that the Kohanim used to wash their hands. That has to be present because the Kohanim need to do rechitzas raglayim v'yadayim. They need to wash their hands and feet before they can do the avodah. So as long as you have that in place, no other instrument of the temple needs to be present. By the way, this has very practical ramifications. Bisman hazeh, we don't have the temple utensils in place on the Temple Mount. According to Reb Meir, that's the reason why we can't bring karbanos today, because we don't have the temple instruments. But according to the Chachamim, you could bring a korban Pesach today. There's a whole question in the poskim, why are you allowed to bring a korban Pesach today? That's why Lubavitcher Rebbe never went to Eretz Yisrael, because he was choshesh that he would be chayiv to bring a korban Pesach. That's at least one of the reasons that they say that he never went. Right, is because he was choshesh that maybe you'd have to bring the korban Pesach bisman hazeh. There's a whole shaila, because at least according to the Chachamim, even without a temple, as long you could make a makeshift mizbeach and you could bring a korban Pesach there.
You need to cure.
So fine. So you'll put together a kior.